Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to the consideration of Senate Congressional Resolution 26, which the clerk will report.
As Conres 26.
Madam President, I ask consent that the clerk read the entire text of the resolution.
Without objection.
As Conres 26, apologizing for the enslavement and racial segregation of African Americans. Whereas during the history of the nation, the United States has grown into a symbol of democracy and freedom around the world. Whereas the legacy of African Americans is interwoven with the very fabric of the democracy and freedom of the United States. Whereas millions of Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States and the 13 American colonies from 1619 through 1865. Whereas Africans forced into slavery were brutalized, humiliated, dehumanized, and subjected to the indignity of being stripped of their names and heritage. Whereas many enslaved families were torn apart after family members were sold separately. Whereas the system of slavery, racism against people of African descent, upon which it depended, became enmeshed in the social fabric of the United States. Whereas slavery was not officially abolished until the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States in 1865 after the end of the Civil War. Whereas after emancipation from 246 years of slavery, African Americans soon saw the fleeting political, social, and economic gains they made during Reconstruction eviscerated by racism, lynching, disenfranchisement, black codes, and racial segregation laws that imposed a rigid system of officially sanctioned racial segregation in virtually all areas of life. Whereas a system of racial segregation known as Jim Crow, which arose in certain parts of the United States after the Civil War to create separate and unequal societies for whites and African Americans, was a direct result of the racism against people of African descent and was engendered by slavery. Whereas a system of Jim Crow laws officially existed until the 1960s, a century after the official end of slavery in the United States, until Congress took action to end it. But the vestiges of Jim Crow continue to this day. Whereas African Americans continue to suffer from the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws, long after both systems were formally abolished through enormous damage and loss, both tangible and intangible, including the loss of human dignity and liberty. Whereas the story of the enslavement and the segregation of African Americans and the dehumanizing atrocities committed against them should not be purged from or minimized in the telling of the history of the United States. Whereas those African Americans who suffered under slavery and Jim Crow laws and their descendants exemplify the strength of the human character and provide a model of courage, commitment, and perseverance. Whereas on July 8, 2003, during a trip to Gorée Island, Senegal, a former slave port, President George W. Bush acknowledged the continuing legacy of slavery in life in the United States and the need to confront that legacy when he stated that slavery was one of the greatest crimes of history. The racial bigotry fed by slavery did not end with slavery or with segregation, and many of the issues that still trouble America have roots in the bitter experience of other times. But however long the journey, our destiny is set: liberty and justice for all. Whereas President Bill Clinton acknowledged the deep-seated problems caused by the continuing legacy of racism against African Americans that began with slavery when he initiated a national dialogue about race. Whereas an apology for centuries of brutal dehumanization and injustices cannot erase the past, but confession of the wrongs committed and a formal apology to African Americans will help bind the wounds of the nation that are rooted in slavery and can speed racial healing and reconciliation and help the people of the United States understand the past and honor the history of all people of the United States. Whereas the legislatures of the Commonwealth of Virginia, the states of Alabama, Florida, Maryland, and North Carolina have taken the lead in adopting resolutions officially expressing appropriate remorse for slavery, and other state legislatures are considering similar resolutions. And whereas it is important for the people of the United States who legally recognize slavery through the Constitution and the laws of the United States to make a formal apology for slavery and its successor, Jim Crow, so they can move forward and seek reconciliation, justice, and harmony for all the people of the United States. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Senate, the House of Representatives concurring, that the sense of the Congress is the following. 1. Apology for the enslavement and segregation of African Americans. The Congress, A, acknowledges the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery and Jim Crow laws. B, apologizes to African Americans on behalf of the people of the United States for the wrongs committed against them and their ancestors who suffered under slavery and Jim Crow laws.
The clerk just read for the first time ever in this body what we should have done a long time ago: an apology for slavery and the Jim Crow laws, which for a century after emancipation deprived millions of Americans their basic human rights, equal justice under law, and equal opportunities. Today, the Senate will unanimously make that apology.
Great injustice was woven into the fabric of our nation. Slavery, and the racial segregation that followed, have left a tragic legacy that divided this country in the bloodiest war we have yet known. It is a legacy that still affects each and every one of us this day.
What we're saying here in the United States Senate today is that a wrong was done. A wrong of slavery was done. A wrong of slavery was done by the federal government of the United States of America. A wrong of segregation was done by the federal government of the United States of America. And we acknowledge that. We say it was wrong, and we ask for forgiveness for that.